Go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy to get 20% off your first month of cognitive behavioural therapy, with weekly sessions online with a therapist, in addition to worksheets, a journal, meditation and yoga videos, and unlimited messaging. There's strong evidence that CBT can help people who hoard, and accessing therapy online can be affordable and accessible. Find out more and get your discount at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy.
Normally, being a little extra might be a bit much, but not when it comes to healthcare. That's why United Healthcare's Health Protector Guard fixed indemnity insurance plans, underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, supplement your primary plan so you manage out-of-pocket costs. Learn more at uh1.com. Normally, being a little extra can be a bit much, but when it comes to healthcare, it pays to be extra. And United Healthcare makes it easy with Health Protector Guard fixed indemnity insurance plans. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, they supplement your primary plan, helping you manage out-of-pocket costs without the usual requirements and restrictions like deductibles and enrollment periods. So when it comes to covering your medical bills, you can feel good about being a little extra. Visit uh1.com to find the Health Protector Guard plan for you.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Welcome to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder podcast. I am drowning in stuff and trying to find a way out. Listen as I explore the issues and delve deep as somebody profoundly affected by hoarding disorder. Find out more, including links to subscribe to the podcast and all my social media at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I'm going to start by reading out a review, and this came via Reddit. Thanks so much for doing this podcast. I feel so supported by it, and the suggestions and tips you give are fantastic. Your openness and honesty are inspiring. And I also got this on Twitter. I just came across your podcast and have listened for 2 hours straight as I got caught up on dishes. I can't wait to listen to them all. I feel hope. You are brilliant. Thank you, Moss Fairy 2. You are brilliant too. Honestly, every time I get feedback like this, it is just so heartening, and it helps me. It helps me keep going with the podcast. It helps me keep going with my own home as well. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about tolerating discomfort. And that might sound like a strange topic to cover, but once I became aware that it was an issue for me and for a lot of people who hoard, it became something I wanted to discuss on here, because if we can master this, then that's going to massively help. So nobody enjoys discomfort or distress, and it's natural that we try and avoid it. We don't want to be too hot or have a headache or feel sick. But if we're unable to tolerate any kind of discomfort or distress, and we fight and avoid feeling them at all costs, it can have a really detrimental effect on our lives. Now, it's especially relevant to hoarders because for us, discarding items is uncomfortable. In many ways, it might bring up fear, it might bring up sadness, it might bring up anxiety, it might bring up regret or guilt. And if we spend our lives avoiding facing those feelings, avoiding that discomfort, avoiding that distress, we're never going to be able to make our homes livable. So the thing to remember is that we can dislike feeling discomfort or distress without resorting to doing everything in our power to avoid them. we have to be able to say, this feels rough, I don't like how this feels, but I can get through it, rather than throwing everything at never feeling the discomfort that we associate with dehoarding and discarding. Because sitting there with maybe some items your late mother left you, or maybe your school records from childhood, or maybe a bunch of craft supplies you bought in a manic episode, or maybe a bunch of clothes that don't fit. It's not pleasant to try and go through them and make decisions about them and be proactive and be kind of assertive with yourself. It's going to bring stuff up. And part of why a lot of us can't discard and can't dehoard is because we're so scared of those feelings that we will do anything we can to not feel them, including not sitting down with that pile of stuff to sort. So there is a recognized phenomenon in psychology called distress intolerance. And there's various definitions of it, but there is a group called the Centre for Clinical Interventions in Australia, and they described it as a perceived inability to fully experience unpleasant, aversive, or uncomfortable emotions, and is accompanied by a desperate need to escape the uncomfortable emotions. I will link to the Centre for Clinical Intervention in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. So, something interesting about that definition is that it describes it as a perceived inability to fully experience those emotions, because we think we can't cope. But if you keep listening, you'll see that to some degree we can. The problem is that the more we fight these feelings, the stronger they surge up and make themselves heard. Fearing and avoiding distress magnifies the distress. It doesn't suppress it. Plus, avoiding the distress and discomfort associated with dehoarding means you don't dehoard. And it might be that you've never learned how to tolerate distress, or perhaps you feel discomfort more acutely than most people. It's impossible to measure how much I feel discomfort compared to you, compared to the person next door. But it's inevitable that some people feel it more passionately, more deeply than others. It might be that if you were emotional or distressed or upset as a child, you were mocked for it or punished for it. Plus, avoiding distress sounds like a good thing to do. Who wants distress? Nobody. So the idea of avoiding distress might initially sound positive or helpful or like what you should be doing. So that reinforces that suppressing it or avoiding it is a helpful skill when it really, really isn't. Because sorting through stuff, choosing what to keep, what to discard, facing up to your hoard and trying to act on it, it is uncomfortable. You might feel anxious about it. You might have had memories triggered by things you find. You might relive grief when you find an item, say something that belonged to somebody you've lost. You might also panic when you face up to the sheer scale of the work you have to do. That's a very familiar one in my life. Or you just might simply hate the process and want to quit. All of that is uncomfortable and most of it is distressing. And I can't reinforce enough, it makes complete sense that we want to avoid it. So if you find yourself thinking things like, this is too hard, or I can't cope, or this is unbearable, that might be indications that you're unable to tolerate distress, or that you avoid distress or discomfort at all costs. So if we can stop avoiding discomfort, we stand a better chance of being able to tackle our hoard, but also other things in life that we currently avoid to avoid distress. Perhaps you have panic attacks occasionally when you go out, so at some point you decided that going out was just too risky in case you had a panic attack. So you haven't been out of the house. That sounds to my untrained ear like distress intolerance. I knew someone who got stuck in a lift. That's an elevator to the Americans. And so she avoided that lift. This was a building with a lot of lifts. So she avoided that lift for a while. And then she was in a different lift in the same building, and it juddered a bit, and it was fine. Nothing happened. But it made her panic. And so she started avoiding all the lifts in that building to avoid feeling that fear that she felt when she got in a broken down lift the first time. And then in a bit more time, she was avoiding all lifts in all places. And it was when she started to have those panicky feelings in any small confined space that she knew she was in trouble. And that was when she sought some help and some support, because avoiding that initial feeling of how horrible it was to get stuck in a broken down lift then led to avoiding more and more and more and more and limiting her life more and more and more and more. So it's not just with hoarding that it can affect us, but obviously the focus on this podcast is hoarding. So what does it look like avoiding distress or avoiding discomfort? It can be things like avoiding the task altogether, or starting, decluttering and backing off and stopping. It might be checking and rechecking and rechecking your rubbish bags or your donation bags. It might be distracting yourself, like halfway through a pile, picking up a book you find and reading that instead. But it can also be things like self-harm or drinking too much. And it might sound paradoxical if you're not familiar with self-harm that it can be used to avoid feeling discomfort, because surely hurting yourself causes discomfort. And it does, but for many people who self-harm, the physical discomfort of cuts or burns or whatever is far more tolerable than the emotional discomfort they're trying to avoid feeling. And this all becomes habitual. We learn that we can avoid difficult emotions, so we start to do it more and more and more. We do it automatically, which in my experience, and quite ironically, kind of reinforces the fear that you can't cope with the initial emotion, or it reinforces the idea that distress or discomfort are absolutely intolerable. The more you push that discomfort away, the more certainly my brain says, well, that's clearly intolerable. I obviously can't cope with that. If I avoid it to this degree, I'd better steer clear of it. So it reinforces itself. One thing to remember is that often avoiding one kind of discomfort creates other forms of discomfort. So if you are avoiding the discomfort of decluttering, you are creating the discomfort of living in a hoarded home. There's one discomfort replacing another discomfort. So it's worth having a think about the kinds of discomfort or distress that you're avoiding, and also what the consequences of avoiding those things are. It's different for every person, but it might well be that you make less progress at home. It might be that it limits other activities you do. Have a think about it. And I don't know the clinical terminology for what I'm about to describe, but I do know that the more I push a certain emotional feeling away, the more my brain tries to push it back into my awareness. It's like I need to feel it. So if I push it away enough, it resurfaces, maybe in a really intense dream or in another part of my life, or just pops up out of nowhere. Or for some people, it can resurface in a different manifestation, like as a headache or as general feelings of stress. So while avoiding having to tolerate discomfort, it sounds initially like it would make you happier. It creates loads of problems of its own. But just as we learn to avoid distress at all costs, we can also learn to sit with it. We can learn to tolerate discomfort. Because when you think about it, life is made up of a whole lot of feelings and emotions and experiences. Few people, if any, get through life without experiencing intense grief or a period of anxiety or times when they can't sleep or when they feel ill. We all go through discomfort that we can and do cope with. Perhaps the weather's too hot and we're uncomfortable and we're sweating. Perhaps we're in the queue at the supermarket and there's a toddler screaming and it's going right through your brain. Perhaps we drank too much coffee and can't get to sleep. Perhaps you feel like you're losing your best friend and you're grieving. Perhaps you've had a headache all day. Perhaps someone from your past dies. We don't relish any of these feelings or emotions, but we do, in the large part, cope with them. And reminding yourself that you're able to cope with some kinds of discomfort may actually help to reassure you that you're not unable to cope with discomfort at all. Just that certain forms of discomfort feel unbearable, but just because you fear they will feel unbearable, or even if they do feel unbearable in the moment, that doesn't mean you can't get through it. I have suffered grief that felt absolutely unbearable for quite a period of time. And if you'd given me the choice of feeling that or not, I would have probably said, take it away. This is the worst thing I've ever felt. But the fact is I couldn't do that. I had lost the people that I missed. I had lost the people I was grieving for. And I somehow came out the other side. And so I have to kind of tell myself, if you can lose those people and get through that, then surely you can tolerate some discomfort when it involves making decisions about a pile of paperwork or a box of books. For me, and many of you listening, the distress that feels unbearable will be focused on making decisions about items or feeling the feelings associated with discarding items or trying to come up with a plan for de-hoarding, anything along those lines. Now, none of these emotions or feelings are wrong. It's normal to feel grief when we lose somebody. It's normal to feel anxiety and depression and fear when we're trying to de-hoard our homes. It's an immense task and it's an immensely difficult one. But it's not sustainable and it's not practical if we're going to make any change at all. I'll be back in a sec.
Now on Broadway, An Enemy of the People is a New York Times critic's pick. Jeremy Strong is one of the great actors of his generation, hails the Chicago Tribune. In a performance the Wall Street Journal praises as powerfully affecting and bitterly funny. Michael Imperioli sets off sparks, cheers the Hollywood Reporter. Victoria Pedretti is luminous, raves variety. From director Sam Gold and playwright Amy Herzog, An Enemy of the People is urgent, electrifying, and haunting, declares USA Today. An Enemy of the People, on Broadway through June 16th only.
A lot can happen in 3 years, like a chatbot may be your new best friend. But what won't change? Needing health insurance. United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans, underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage that lasts nearly 3 years in some states. Learn more at uh1.com.
Hey, collectors. This is Rachel CV, host of the Hoarding podcast. My podcast is chock full of tips and tricks on how to overcome compulsive hoarding disorder and chronic disorganization. I'd love for you to tune in so that you can learn about why you save things and how to help yourself or how to help a family member or friend who struggles with clutter. You can find me at hoardganize.com or download my podcast on any of your favorite podcast apps.
So, first of all, I would say try to identify when you avoid distress. chances are it's so ingrained and automatic that you don't know you're doing it. So start really looking out for it and try and drill down on what that feeling or emotion is. What is it that somewhere along the line you decided as self-protection was intolerable? Because if you know what you're dealing with, you're on the road to resolving it. And see if you can work out why it's so terrifying to you. Is it just a habit by now that you avoid it? Or is there something deeper? But importantly, reassure yourself that you are capable of feeling that feeling. Remind yourself that you can tolerate distress. You can tolerate the stress when you're in a traffic jam and you're going to be late, and you can tolerate feeling hungry when your dinner's cooking. You might hate those feelings, but you can feel them and get through them without being damaged by them. So if you can tolerate any other kind of discomfort, you can also tolerate the discomfort of having to make difficult decisions or having to say goodbye to certain items, even if they belong to somebody you've loved and lost, or even if they were meaningful to you once, but they're not anymore. And remind yourself, this is one I've really been trying to do myself, but try reminding yourself that pushing the emotion away doesn't remove the discomfort. Sometimes it displaces it, creating kind of different discomfort in its place. Other times it just re-emerges later in the day, and not dealing with the problem, with the hoard, creates and reinforces just different discomfort. It's important, I've found, to try and sit with the uncomfortable feelings. Now, this isn't the same as wallowing in them or being consumed by them. It's more a bit like a kind of mindfulness practice, just sitting, feeling them and observing what you feel. Just experience it. Say, okay, oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize I had anxiety there, or gosh, I didn't know that was my feeling about that. You might be surprised that it's not as bad as you feared. You might find that the habitual nature of pushing it away has made it seem bigger than the reality actually is. Or you might find that it's actually pretty horrible to sit with. But either way, reassure yourself that it's not a threat to you. You're not in danger from having these feelings. It feels uncomfortable, but you can cope with uncomfortable things. I think of that kind of, when it feels unbearable, I think of it kind of like riding a wave. I have never surfed in my life, but imagine a surfer on an Australian beach with blonde hair and the beautiful blue sky, and they go up on the wave and then it subsides. And that's what these feelings and emotions do. It goes up and it feels terrible, and then it subsides, and that might be really quick or it might take a while. But it does, these feelings and emotions do not last forever. Some people call this urge surfing, which I quite like. But the important thing is that you're not judging it, you're not fighting it, just surf it. And some people find it useful to try and name what it is they're feeling. It can be surprising sometimes, really looking at what's going on in a big, confused cloud of emotions that you'd normally fight off is quite interesting. And it can help you to untangle what's really going on, what you're really resisting, and how you might move on from such intense emotions. Don't judge it. Even if you don't like what comes up, it's okay. Just adopt a curious attitude towards it. Kind of, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know I was anxious about that. That kind of thing. Treat it as an interesting thing to observe. And breathe. breathe. That's the one I forget. Ask yourself, are your shoulders around your ears? Is your jaw clenched? Look with interest at what's coming up. Are the thoughts and feelings what you expected? Is it really as bad as you feared it would be? Sometimes it is, but often it's not. But either way, if you can successfully sit with it, you'll be able to make so much more progress. And you'll learn, even if it takes lots of attempts to really convince yourself, you will learn that the discomfort and the distress does pass. You might want to go back and listen to episode 34 about how hoarders can use the fear ladder. I will link to that in the show notes. And use the fear ladder in combination with sitting with the distress, so you can begin tolerating the distress around the easiest or the least anxiety-provoking situations before building up to the harder ones. It might not be a great idea to throw yourself right into the most difficult pile in your house. And you don't have to only do this around discomfort around hoarding. If there are other aspects of distress that you avoid at all costs, especially if it's, causing its own problems in your life, this stuff can apply to all of those things. The more you do it, in my experience, and according to all the research I've read while looking into this, the more you do it, the more you can reassure yourself that you can do it. And just as the initial cycle self-reinforced, actually challenging it and addressing it can also self-reinforce. It's powerful. You'll be gradually dismantling all of that dysfunctional evidence, in inverted commas, that your brain has collected that's convinced you can't cope with this. And you'll be gradually replacing that with evidence that you can cope with it. You can sit with it. You can tolerate it. It's okay. And you might sometimes feel overwhelmed, but I honestly think that will happen less than you think it would, because you've avoided this discomfort for so long. You've provided ongoing evidence, in inverted commas, that something is intolerable. But that evidence is not reliable. It's based on fear, and it's based on how you imagine it will be to tolerate distress. It's not based on how it actually is tolerating distress. And it's only by practicing it, by sitting with it, observing it, waiting for it to pass, and realizing you got through it, that you can retrain your brain to stop avoiding it. In just 1 second, I'll give you my top tip of the week. In the meantime, please do subscribe to the podcast, review it, 5 stars would be amazing, and share it with your friends or anyone who might be interested or who might benefit from it. It all really helps. To find more ways to support the website, the podcast, and my overall de-hoarding project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Now, back to your top tip. So this week's top tip is James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, who regular listeners will have heard reference to several times now. He's talking on a podcast called Be Well by Kelly, which I will link to in the show notes. It's from a few years ago. Have a listen.
Every action you take is like a vote for the type of person you wish to become. And so these small choices, going to the gym for 5 minutes, or, like making one small healthy meal, or writing one sentence, or meditating for 60 seconds. No, they don't seem like they radically transform your life, but they do cast a vote for being that kind of person. Doing one push-up does not change your body, but it does cast a vote for, I'm the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. And writing one sentence does not finish the novel, but it does cast a vote for, I'm a writer. And in the long run, true behavior change is really identity change. It's really learning to look at yourself in a new way. And your habits, especially small habits that are done consistently, they keep casting these votes for being that kind of person. And I think in the long run, those short workouts, those things that seem insignificant, that don't satisfy the perfectionist inside of you, they actually count for a lot, because the circumstances weren't ideal or it wasn't your best day, but you still cast a vote for the type of person you want to become. And that's really meaningful in the long run.
So cast a vote for yourself not being a hoarder. Do one thing that casts a vote in that direction, then another, then another. Keep casting those votes. All right, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. You can find more online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at @thathoarder and on Facebook at Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to this podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes.